Gay barn. A secluded farm, a quiet life, and a stranger who arrives to change everything. I had lived alone for years. My farm was miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by endless fields and the constant sound of horses in the stables. My days followed a simple rhythm. Wake up early, feed the animals, mend the fences, and watch the sun dip below the horizon. No surprises, no complications. And then he showed up. Tall, muscular, dark skin glistening under the midday sun. He introduced himself as Malcolm Carter, a ranch hand looking for work. His deep voice carried a confidence that unsettled me, though I couldn't quite understand why. I needed the help. Winters were harsh, and tending to the horses alone was getting harder each year. So, I hired him. That was the moment everything changed. What happens when two men, isolated on a farm, are forced to confront their desires? Don't miss a second of this intense, emotional journey. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. The sun hung high over the fields as I wiped the sweat off my forehead. It was another scorching afternoon, and I had just finished hauling a few heavy bales of hay into the barn. My name is Ethan Walker, and for the past 6 years, this farm had been my entire world. I liked it that way. There were no distractions, no complications, just me, the land, and the horses. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, which meant I rarely saw another soul unless I went out for supplies. It was a quiet life, maybe even a lonely one, but I had convinced myself that loneliness was just a part of who I was. Then, out of nowhere, a deep voice broke the silence. "You the owner?" I turned around, squinting against the sunlight. A man stood at the entrance of my property, his silhouette framed against the bright sky. He was tall, at least 6 feet, broad-shouldered, and built like a damned tank. His dark skin gleamed with sweat, his black t-shirt clinging to his muscular chest. He carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and his eyes, a rich shade of brown, met mine without hesitation. "Yeah," I said, still catching my breath. "Who's asking?" He stepped closer, offering a firm handshake. "Malcolm Carter. I'm looking for work. Heard from a guy in town that you might need some help around here." I hadn't told anyone I needed help, but the truth was, I did. The work had been piling up, and winter wasn't far off. Still, hiring someone meant having company, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. "You got experience with horses?" I asked, crossing my arms. Malcolm nodded. "Worked on ranches since I was 16. I know how to break a horse, clean a stall, and ride better than most." He spoke with confidence, and there was something in his stance that told me he wasn't bluffing. I sized him up, debating whether hiring him was a good idea. "Room and board included?" he asked, shifting his duffel bag. That made me hesitate. The idea of him staying here, under my roof, unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite name. But I ignored that feeling and nodded. "Yeah, there's a spare room in the main house." A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, and for some reason, my pulse picked up. "Then I guess I work for you now, boss." His words sent a strange shiver down my spine. The first few days with Malcolm on the farm were an adjustment. He was a hard worker, no doubt about that. He woke up at dawn, got straight to work without needing to be told, and handled the horses with a calm confidence that even I had to admire. But there was something about him that unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Too sure, too damn self-assured, like he belonged here more than I did. Or maybe it was the way his deep voice echoed in the barn, smooth and unbothered, making my skin prickle in ways I didn't want to think about. Either way, I found myself watching him more than I should. That afternoon, I was in the barn, brushing down one of the mares when Malcolm walked in, carrying a bale of hay over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. His black t-shirt clung to his chest, damp from sweat, and his arms flexed with every movement. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the mare. "You're quiet," Malcolm said, setting the hay down. "That normal for you?" I shrugged. "Not much to talk about." He leaned against the stall door, watching me. "You always work this place alone?" "For the past 6 years," I said. "Had a couple of ranch hands now and then, but they never stayed long." Malcolm smirked. "Guess I'll have to stick around just to break that streak." I let out a dry chuckle. "We'll see." For a moment there was only the sound of the horses and the occasional rustle of hay. But then Malcolm stepped closer, his eyes lingering on me just a little too long. "Something on your mind?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He tilted his head. "You don't talk much, but you watch everything. What are you looking for?" I clenched my jaw. "Just making sure you're doing your job." His smirk deepened, like he didn't believe me. "Right." I turned away before he could say anything else, my pulse annoyingly fast. I didn't like how easily he got under my skin. The rest of the day went by in a blur of work, but that damn conversation stuck in my head. That night, after finishing up, I found myself on the porch, a cold beer in my hand as I stared out at the open fields. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the silence was comforting until the screen door creaked open behind me. Malcolm stepped out, beer in his own hand. "Mind if I join you?" I didn't answer, but I didn't send him away either. He took that as permission and sat on the porch steps, stretching out his long legs. "You ever get tired of it?" he asked after a few minutes. I frowned. "Tired of what?" "This." He gestured at the land. "The quiet, the isolation." I took a slow sip of my beer. "If I wanted noise, I wouldn't be here." He hummed, taking a drink from his own bottle. "Guess that makes sense." We sat in silence for a while, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was strange, having him here, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body in the cool night air. Then he said, "You ever get lonely?" The question caught me off guard. I turned my head, meeting his gaze. It was unreadable, but there was something there, something heavy. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked back at the fields, exhaling slowly. "Not really." It was a lie. Malcolm didn't call me out on it, but I could feel his eyes on me, searching. "Well," he finally said, his voice quieter now, "if you ever do, I'm here." His words sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, gripping my beer bottle a little tighter. "We start early tomorrow. Get some rest." Malcolm studied me for a second longer, then nodded. "Night, boss." He stood up and walked inside, leaving me alone on the porch. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet felt different. The days passed, and Malcolm settled into the rhythm of the farm as if he had always been there. He worked hard, never complained, and took care of the horses with a level of skill that impressed me. But despite his easygoing nature, I couldn't shake the tension that lingered between us. I told myself it was just the adjustment of having someone around after years of solitude, that it was nothing, but I was lying to myself. One evening, just before sunset, I found myself in the barn again, finishing up for the day. The smell of hay and leather filled the air as I tightened the last saddle strap on one of the mares. Malcolm was across from me, leaning against the stall with his arms crossed, watching. "You always this serious?" he asked, a teasing lilt in his voice. I glanced at him. "What do you mean?" He smirked. "You don't joke, don't relax. Hell, I don't think I've seen you smile once since I got here." I rolled my eyes and turned back to the saddle. "Didn't hire you to make me smile." Malcolm chuckled. "That right?" What did you hire me for then? The way he said it, low, almost testing me, made my pulse jump. I swallowed, tightening the strap a little harder than necessary. To work, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Malcolm didn't push. Instead, he walked over, his steps slow and deliberate. He reached out, brushing his fingers over the horse's mane, standing close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. I think you like having me around, he said, his voice softer now. I stiffened. Don't start. He tilted his head, studying me. Start what? I turned to him then, meeting his gaze head on. He was close, too close. I could see the hint of a smile playing on his lips, the way his eyes darkened slightly. It would be so easy, but it would be a mistake. I took a step back, putting distance between us. We got an early morning, I said, my voice rough. Get some sleep. Malcolm watched me for a moment longer before nodding. Sure thing, boss. But as he walked away, I knew this wasn't over. That night I barely slept. The house felt too quiet, too small, like it wasn't just me and my own damn skin anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Malcolm, his smirk, his knowing gaze, the way he looked at me like he saw something I wasn't ready to admit. At some point, I gave up trying to fight it. I got up, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the sky full of stars stretching endlessly above me. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, trying to clear my head. Then I heard footsteps behind me. You always this restless? I turned to see Malcolm standing on the porch, shirtless, wearing only a pair of sweatpants that hung low on his hips. The moonlight cast shadows over his chest, highlighting every sculpted muscle. I swallowed hard. Couldn't sleep. He nodded like he understood, then stepped down onto the grass, stopping a few feet from me. Something on your mind? I should have said no. Should have made up some excuse, gone back inside and ignored whatever this thing between us was turning into. But instead I asked, Why'd you really come here, Malcolm? His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Needed a fresh start. That all? He studied me for a long moment, then smirked. Why? You hoping I came here for something else? The air between us was thick, charged. My breath felt too heavy, my skin too warm despite the night air. Go to bed, I said, my voice quieter now. Malcolm held my gaze for a second longer before he let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Whatever you say, boss. Then he turned and walked back into the house, leaving me standing there with my heart hammering in my chest. The morning air was crisp as I stepped outside, the sky still painted with streaks of orange and pink. I had barely slept. My thoughts had been tangled in knots all night, Malcolm's voice echoing in my head. You hoping I came here for something else? I shook the thought away and focused on the work ahead. But even as I moved through my morning routine, saddling the horses, checking the fences, and hauling supplies, I felt it. That tension, the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. And it only got worse when Malcolm walked into the barn. He was already dressed for the day, his usual black t-shirt stretched across his broad chest, jeans hanging low on his hips. He moved like he owned the place. Like he belonged here. Like he belonged. I clenched my jaw, gripping the saddle tighter. Morning, boss, Malcolm said, his voice smooth, easy, like last night hadn't happened. I barely glanced at him. We've got a lot to do today, he smirked. So, no small talk. Got it. I ignored him and focused on adjusting the straps on the saddle, trying to keep my hands from shaking. But Malcolm didn't move. I could feel him watching me, standing too close, his presence heavy in the quiet barn. You ever gonna talk about it? He asked. his voice quieter now. I stiffened. Talk about what? You know what. I turned to him, meeting his gaze head on. Drop it, Malcolm. He studied me for a long second, then let out a slow breath, shaking his head with a smirk. Sure thing, boss. The way he said it, low and knowing, made something snap inside me. I turned away before I did something stupid, before I grabbed him by that damn shirt and... No, I needed to get my head straight. I grabbed my hat, shoved it on, and stalked out of the barn. The day passed in a blur of work, and I did my best to keep my distance. But as the sun started to set, a storm rolled in, dark clouds gathering over the horizon. The air was thick with the promise of rain, the kind of heavy summer storm that could turn the dirt roads into a muddy mess in minutes. I was out by the fence line, tightening some loose wire, when I heard footsteps behind me. Storm's coming in fast, Malcolm said. I didn't turn around. Yeah, we need to get the horses settled before it hits. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Malcolm stepped closer. You gonna avoid me forever? I exhaled sharply, gripping the fence post. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Liar. That one word sent heat rushing through me. I turned around fast, too fast, and suddenly we were face to face. The wind picked up around us, kicking up dust, making the moment feel even more charged. You really want to do this right now? I asked, my voice tight. Malcolm tilted his head, eyes locked on mine. Maybe. I should have stepped back, should have said something to shut this down, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, breathing hard, the storm building around us, the tension between us crackling just as loud as the thunder overhead. Then, out of nowhere, a bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The horses in the pasture spooked, their nervous whinnies cutting through the air. I cursed, turning away from Malcolm. We need to get them inside, now. The moment was gone, replaced by chaos. We ran to the barn, rain starting to fall in heavy drops as we worked quickly to herd the horses into their stalls. By the time we got the last one inside, we were both soaked, breathing hard. The rain pounded against the barn roof, drowning out everything else. I turned to say something, but before I could, Malcolm reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm, warm against my rain-cooled skin. I froze. You gonna keep running from this? He asked, voice barely audible over the storm. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. The rain pounded against the barn roof like a drum, drowning out everything except the sound of our breathing. Malcolm's grip on my wrist was firm, grounding. His dark eyes locked onto mine, filled with something unreadable, but undeniable. I should have pulled away. I should have said something to shut this down before it became something I couldn't control, but I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, heart pounding, skin burning where he touched me. You gonna keep running from this? Malcolm's voice was low, barely audible over the storm. I swallowed hard, trying to force my body to move, to take a step back. This isn't what? His thumb brushed over my wrist, the smallest movement, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Go on, say it. I clenched my jaw. It's nothing. Malcolm exhaled a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Bullshit. I yanked my wrist away, taking a step back, trying to put space between us. We've got work to do, I muttered, turning toward the stalls. But before I could move, Malcolm grabbed my arm, not rough, just enough to stop me. When I turned back, his expression had shifted. He wasn't smirking now. You think I don't see it? His voice was softer now, almost careful. The way you look at me when you think I won't notice. My stomach clenched. You're imagining things, I said, but my voice was hoarse, unconvincing. Malcolm let out a slow breath, his grip loosening. "You really think you're fooling anyone?" I didn't answer, because I didn't have an answer. The storm outside roared, wind shaking the barn doors, rain hammering against the roof. Inside, it was just the two of us, trapped in the thick, suffocating air of something I wasn't ready to name. Malcolm took a step closer. He was warm, solid, the scent of rain and sweat mixing between us. "You want me to stop?" he asked, voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know how to answer that either, because the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. But wanting something and letting yourself have it were two very different things. I took a shaky breath, my hands clenching at my sides. "This can't happen," I forced out. Malcolm studied me for a moment, then nodded, just once. "All right," he said simply. And that should have been the end of it. But then he added, "But if you ever stop lying to yourself, you know where to find me." Then he walked past me, brushing against my shoulder as he went. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing there, soaked, shaking, and more confused than I had ever been. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world outside damp and quiet. I barely slept. My mind wouldn't shut up, replaying every second of what had happened in that barn. I had spent years keeping my world simple, predictable. No distractions, no complications. And now Malcolm had walked into my life and shattered that carefully built control with nothing more than a look. I found him outside by the corral, working the horses like nothing had happened. He was focused, calm, the complete opposite of what was happening in my chest. I stood there for a moment, watching him, thinking about what he had said. "If you ever stop lying to yourself, you know where to find me." I took a breath, steadying myself. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But maybe I was getting there. The days after the storm passed in a blur. Malcolm and I fell back into routine, but something had shifted. He didn't push, he didn't tease. He just worked, kept his distance, gave me space. And somehow, that made it worse. Because now, the silence between us wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. I caught myself watching him more than I should, how he moved, how he handled the horses, how the sun hit his skin just right when he was working in the field. Every time I looked too long, I had to force myself to turn away. But it was getting harder, because the truth was, I wasn't just looking. I was wanting, and I didn't know how to stop. One evening, I stayed out later than usual, checking the fence line. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple, and the air was warm, thick with the scent of earth and hay. I didn't hear Malcolm approach until he was close. "Fence holding up?" His voice was calm, steady. I nodded. "Seems like it." He leaned against the wooden post beside me, arms crossed. "Been real quiet lately." I swallowed, keeping my eyes on the horizon. Just got a lot on my mind. Malcolm nodded slowly, then, after a pause, said, "You don't have to be scared, you know." That made my pulse jump. I turned to him. "Scared of what?" He looked at me, really looked at me, like he wasn't just seeing me, he was seeing through me. "You know what?" I opened my mouth, ready to push him away again, but the words got stuck, because I was tired of pretending, tired of wanting something and convincing myself I couldn't have it. So, for the first time since Malcolm arrived, I told the truth. "I don't know how," I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm didn't move, didn't say anything right away. He just studied me, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he said, "Then let me show you." My breath caught. Then slowly he reached out. Not fast, not forceful. just enough to give me time to pull away. I didn't. His fingers brushed against mine, light, careful, and for the first time, I let myself feel it. The warmth of his skin, the quiet steadiness of his touch. I let myself want it. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I closed the distance. The first touch of his lips was careful, almost hesitant, like he was waiting for me to pull back. But when I didn't, when I leaned in instead, his hands slid up, framing my face, deepening the kiss into something real, something I had been running from for far too long. By the time we pulled apart, my heart was hammering. Malcolm's forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my lips. That wasn't so scary, was it? I let out a shaky laugh. Maybe a little. He smirked. Then we'll take it slow. And just like that, I knew. This was it. No more running, no more pretending, just us. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. What did you think of Ethan and Malcolm's journey? Have you ever had to stop running from something you wanted? Let's talk in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this.